Peter had always thought Christmas was the one time of year that could restore even the deepest cracks in family relationships. A glowing tree, the smell of roasted turkey, laughter echoing across the dining room, these were the images he held in his mind for decades. But this Christmas, at the age of 55, Peter realized that the image he had clung to was nothing more than an illusion, a fragile mirage that his family had deliberately shattered. It all started innocently enough, or at least it seemed so. Peter had lived in the old family home, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the edge of town, ever since his father passed away 10 years prior. His brother, Mark, had moved to the city years earlier and had established a successful career. Their relationship had been cordial, but it wasn't close. Peter had always felt he carried the bulk of the family legacy on his shoulders, the maintenance of the home, the care of their aging mother before she passed, and the stewardship of memories that Mark seemed to have forgotten. Christmas Eve had been unusually tense. Peter had spent the morning in the kitchen, meticulously preparing his mother's favorite stuffing recipe and polishing the silverware that had been in the family for generations. He had set the table with care, imagining the warmth of the evening, the clinking of glasses, the laughter that always made him forget the solitude of his life. When Mark arrived with his family, Peter greeted them with his usual polite warmth. His nieces and nephews ran through the halls, squealing with excitement. But there was something in Mark's demeanor, something Peter couldn't quite place. Mark smiled, but it was the kind of smile that felt rehearsed, the kind that hid something darker beneath. Dinner began in its usual fashion, with polite conversation and the occasional laugh. But as the main course was being served, Mark cleared his throat, and the room went silent. "Peter," Mark said, his tone casual, almost cruel in its nonchalance, "there's something I need to tell you." Peter looked up, eyebrows raised. "What is it?" Mark smiled at his wife, then at Peter. "You're moving. This home no longer belongs to you." For a moment, Peter thought he had misheard. His fork clattered against his plate. "Excuse me?" Mark continued, as if explaining a minor inconvenience. "Mom left the house to me in her will. I've spoken to the lawyers. You have until the end of the month to vacate." The room seemed to close in around Peter. The walls, the chandeliers, even the tree in the corner, all seemed to mock him. This is impossible. Mom would never." "She did," Mark interrupted coldly. "You just didn't get the memo." "I'm sorry, but the house is mine now." Peter felt a strange, suffocating rage. He wanted to shout, to throw something, to demand that Mark explain the betrayal. But he also knew that any reaction would only give Mark the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. So he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and said nothing. He walked to the door, paused, and in a voice that was calm but carried the weight of a storm, said, "Merry Christmas, Mark." And he left. The days that followed were some of the darkest in Peter's life. He wandered through the empty streets of the town, feeling unmoored. The house he had lived in for decades, the house that had been the center of every Christmas, every birthday, every quiet Sunday morning, was now Mark's. Peter's brother had not even offered a discussion, a compromise, or a shred of decency. It was as if Peter had never existed. But Peter wasn't the type to surrender easily. He had spent his life quietly observing, planning, calculating. And now, fueled by betrayal and humiliation, he began to hatch a plan. Peter's first step was simple: gather information. He needed to know everything about Mark's life, the accounts, the assets, the vulnerabilities. He began by visiting local businesses under the guise of old family friends, asking casual questions. He scoured public records, social media, and even reached out to a few lawyers and accountants under the pretense of legal advice. Slowly, a picture emerged. Mark was successful, yes, but reckless. He had invested heavily in risky ventures, carried enormous debts, and relied heavily on the inheritance from the family home to secure his financial position. Peter smiled the first time in days. The weakness in Mark's armor was precisely the leverage he needed. Months passed as Peter meticulously built his strategy. He did not act hastily. He knew that revenge was a delicate art, it required patience, subtlety, and precision. He rented a small apartment in the city, living quietly, almost invisibly. He reached out to Mark's acquaintances under different guises, planting seeds of doubt and gathering more information. Every move he made was deliberate, calculated. Finally, the day came when Peter decided to act. It was another Christmas, exactly 1 year after the fateful dinner. He had invited Mark and his family to the mansion, now under Mark's ownership, for what he described in a letter as a holiday reunion. Mark, eager to assert his dominance and flaunt his newfound ownership, accepted immediately. Peter arrived at the mansion early, dressed impeccably, with a calm smile that hid the storm beneath. He had arranged for a team of contractors to begin renovations as soon as Mark arrived, nothing permanent, just a display of chaos, a prelude to the real plan. When Mark and his family arrived, Peter greeted them warmly, almost affectionately. "Merry Christmas, Mark. I hope you've enjoyed the house." Mark sneered, dismissive. "I don't need your approval, Peter. This house is mine now." Peter gestured toward the living room. "Of course. I thought you'd like to see some of the updates I arranged." Confused, Mark walked toward the room. There, in the center, was a table displaying a carefully curated set of documents, photographs, and letters. Peter began to speak, his voice calm but cutting. "I've spent the past year learning a lot about you, Mark. Your investments, your financial decisions, your debts. It's fascinating how easy it is to manipulate appearances when no one is watching closely." Mark's face hardened. "What are you talking about?" Peter smiled. "I'm talking about the fact that the very inheritance you flaunted, this house, this mansion, was the cornerstone of your financial security. And I've taken steps to ensure that foundation is no longer solid." Before Mark could react, Peter handed the documents to his astonished brother. They revealed a web of financial mismanagement, loans taken against the house, falsified appraisals, and legal discrepancies that could allow Peter to claim ownership, or at the very least, force Mark into a long, costly, and public legal battle. "You see, Mark," Peter said, his voice low and steady, "while you were busy showing off your victory, I was quietly making sure that your victory was as fragile as glass. Enjoy your Christmas, brother. It might be the last one you spend in this house." Mark's family stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the depth of Peter's knowledge or the precision of his plan. Fear and disbelief mingled in the air like a thick fog. Over the next few months, Peter's strategy unfolded perfectly. He did not attack his brother openly, but the legal challenges began to mount. Lawyers contacted Mark daily, creditors inquired about irregularities, and soon the once pristine mansion was a hive of scrutiny and stress. Mark, desperate to maintain his image, tried to negotiate, but Peter remained steadfast. Every move Peter made was subtle, almost invisible, but devastatingly effective. The beauty of Peter's revenge was not in aggression but in patience and precision. He watched as Mark's confidence crumbled, as his family faced uncertainty, and as the empire he had built on arrogance and betrayal began to wobble. Peter never celebrated openly. He knew that real satisfaction came in silence, in watching the consequences unfold. Then, one spring morning, the final piece fell into place. Mark's primary financial backer, concerned by the legal irregularities, withdrew support. Without that backing, Mark faced bankruptcy. The mansion, the symbol of his triumph over Peter, was suddenly in jeopardy. Peter, ever calm, extended an offer. He would assist Mark in stabilizing the situation, on one condition, that he relinquish any claim to the family home permanently. Faced with no other choice, Mark agreed. Peter walked back into the mansion for the first time since that fateful Christmas dinner, older, wiser, and more serene than ever. He did not gloat, nor did he revel in Mark's misfortune. Instead, he felt the quiet satisfaction of justice achieved, not through violence or shouting, but through patience, intelligence, and unyielding resolve. He decorated the tree once more, hung the stockings, and placed the ornaments with care. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Peter reflected on the year past. Betrayal had cut deeply, but it had also awakened in him a clarity and strength he had never known. The house was his again, not because of force, but because he had earned it with foresight and determination. When Mark called to apologize later that day, Peter listened quietly. He accepted the apology, not out of weakness, but out of recognition that some lessons, once learned, cannot be undone. Family could be fractured, but dignity, patience, and strategy could restore a man to his rightful place. And so, Peter spent that Christmas, not in the shadow of betrayal, but in the warmth of victory, a victory forged in silence, calculated with care, and realized with the precision of a lifetime of planning. He smiled, raising a glass to the empty chairs that had once betrayed him, and whispered to himself, "Merry Christmas, indeed."